So, John chapter 21 from verses 1 to 14. My task this evening to attempt to illuminate these verses and give some exhortation, I hope. Indirectly, there's an aspect of it that it's a bit of a character study of John as well. John's writings give us a window into his heart. I think through a Bible study, even in these verses. His gospel lingers on the nature of who Jesus was, the Word made flesh, true light, the Good Shepherd. Revelation expands his horizon, showing a faithful witness who endured exile and still worshipped. Mark chapter 16, verses 4 to 8, gives a context. Well done, Gary. Mark chapter 16 from verses 4 to 8 gives a context to the start of this verse. But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, using my New International Version, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. They were told to go to Galilee. And as we are in John, we'll be spending our time in John, properly. John chapter 21, verses 1 to 14. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, another name for the Sea of Galilee. So it gives us a context as to why they were in Galilee. And John specifically centering the disciples in this location. There's a thing that's kind of stood out for me in this I've probably not noticed before. We are viewing a kind of evolution or transition in the spiritual character of this character, John. And we have, I suppose, in a sense, two snapshots. He once tried to stop someone casting out demons because the man wasn't part of their group, but Jesus redirected him toward a larger vision. If we go to Mark chapter 3 and verse 17. Chapter 3 and verse 17. James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. A description, as it were, of their disposition, as it were, their character. If we go to chapter 10 and verse 35, still in Mark, chapter 10 and verse 35. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism that I baptize? There's an impetuousness in reference to this character. Luke chapter 9, he wanted to call down fire on a Samaritan village. Luke chapter 9 and verse 51. Luke chapter 9 and verse 51. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead and went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? This was the third year of his ministry, so 6 months to go, as it were. We're still in the midst of this, I suppose, transition of this sort of character. Do you want me to call down fire from heaven? And yet later he accepted hospitality in places that once felt outside this sort of circle. From this sort of narrowness to welcome, from noise to a steady, resilient love. Let's reflect on the power of Jesus and Scripture together as we trace his transformation. So the Bible lets us watch John grow under Jesus' patient care. He was also a character who wrote the most beautiful, eloquent theological description of the life of Jesus. He followed Jesus all the way to the cross when the rest of the disciples had fled. He was so humble and self-effacing that he only mentioned himself in his gospel account as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John chapter 13, verse 23. And today we are still looking at the character and the life of this apostle. The lens through which we should view John's gospel is noted in the previous chapter. John chapter 20 from verse 32, or from verse 30 to 32. Jesus did many other miracles, did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's very much the lens through which we should look through and consider his writings. These accounts were recorded so that you and I might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the anointed Son of God. And it's quite funny amidst everything, because I'm a simpleton. It's the bit whereby in these 14 verses, it contained a vivid and practical and simple vision of the resurrected Jesus. The physical, fleshy, resurrected Jesus that they saw, they talked with and ate with. How simple and clear is that? So 14 verses with a great deal to say, probably much that I will have missed. Peter fishing. What's unique about that? He's a fisherman. Peter naked. 153 fish. Hoping some of you will develop that. They saw the risen Jesus the third time, again within a few days of having seen him previously, and yet they didn't recognize him. So, verse 1. After these things indicated that the meeting in Galilee took place at least a week after the resurrection. So this helps to understand that the disciples didn't go to Galilee immediately after the first appearance of Jesus. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 7. And it's only John who refers to the Sea of Galilee, or as the Sea of Tiberias. So, the context, we have a party of disciples, verse 1. We've got Simon Peter, we've got Thomas, Didymus, we've got Nathanael from Cana, verse 4 and 5, the sons of Zebedee, the two sons, James and John the fishermen. So we've got logical and kind of sort of consistent. Seamen also, they're also prominent sort of seamen, really, the two sons of Zebedee, Peter, James and John. They were significant because they were there at the Transfiguration. And their mother asking for a special place for her sons. 26 and verse 37, I think in Matthew in Gethsemane before the crucifixion. He took those to help him prepare, as it were, these sons of thunder. Mark chapter 3 and verse 17, identified as the sons of thunder, as I said before. And even at times of intimate healing, James and John were there. I think that's Luke chapter 8 and verse 51, but I might have got that wrong. And John 21 and verse 2, prominent characters. And there were two more who are not necessarily identified. But note the fact that the sons of Zebedee, that they are not named, is a further indication that John is the author. He names other apostles present, but refuses to name himself. So it gives some consistency in that thread, as he's done throughout the book. So we have these two unnamed disciples. The two are not named, it's suggested could be Andrew and Philip, who are mentioned together in chapter 6, verses 7 to 8, and chapter 12 and verse 22. So we have these 7 disciples. And in verse 2, Peter invites some of the 12 and 7 disciples for a night of fishing. So we have sort of 2 boats, and they've been out fishing all night. So all night fishing. I don't know, in the land of Google, it said that Aristotle said that it was a favoured time for people to fish. I think lots of people said it's a good time to fish at night, as it were. And we see in verse 4, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. It wasn't far away, 100 meters, 100 yards. Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. So 100 yards from the shore, he was not recognized. And it's a kind of common theme. John chapter 20, verses 13 to 16. Mary Magdalene. They asked a woman, "Why are you crying?" "They've taken away my Lord," she said, "and I do not know where they have laid him." At this time, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." And they were aware of the rest. So much time in his company, she didn't recognize him immediately. Chapter 20, same chapter, verse 19. On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. And later, still in this context, he breathed the Holy Spirit on them. But they didn't recognize him, as it were, until his wounds were shown, pointed out to them. Obviously, they could even touch them. So he bade them to go into Galilee, giving them the promise of meeting them there. We see in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 7, and Mark 16, verse 7. This promise we find he fulfilled in the way John relates here. This was the 7th appearance of our Lord after the resurrection. So they're told to go to Galilee. So a night of fishing, favourite time to fish. And verse 4, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, but they didn't recognize him. His appearance is somewhat mysterious. The evangelist doesn't tell us how he came there. Walk? Did he fly? Did he just appear? Very much the same happened when he appeared with the disciples. It was a locked room and he appeared. Just as in the 2 previous appearances recorded in chapter 20, Jesus seems to have appeared unexpectedly. So, 100 yards away from the shore, as it were, they didn't realize it was him. Why not? Well, it was perhaps that bit from night to day, dusk, as it were. The light might have been weak. Perhaps the sea was even misty or foggy. They were some 100 yards away from him. Doubtless, they were not expecting to see him. And it's the thing, if you don't expect to see somebody, you don't necessarily have that kind of frame of reference, as it were. They did not recognize him. Recognition. Identification. Words are fascinating. Cognitive, so of the mind. The act of knowing who a person is or what a thing is because you have recognition. So The act of knowing who a person is or what a thing is because you have recognition and acknowledgement of the senses. So acknowledgement of the senses, seeing and touching them, etc., or recall of the mind. So seen, heard, or experienced them before. Same words re-Mary in the previous chapter. So recognition is more than just seeing in a sense. Re-Mary in the previous chapter in verse 14, she did not realize. Did he look different, or did he intentionally prevent or muddy her or the other's perception? So he was veiled, perhaps cognitively or physically. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 17. You don't need to go to Matthew chapter 28 and verse 17. Okay. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. So doubt can mess about with our understanding of who a person is. Is it that person? Was it? I haven't seen somebody for a while. You've got an impression, but actually they look slightly different. They're not always dressed that way. Luke chapter 24 and verse 16, on the road to Emmaus. And Jesus talking to us, road to Emmaus. Chapter 24 and verse 16. As they talked, now that same day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. They were kept from recognizing him. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him, closed or veiled in some way. And I think that's a powerful thing, I think, within this. It's more than just simple not knowing who he was, as it were. Verse 30, still in Luke 24. Wow, I'm being consistent for a change. Luke 24 and verse 37. Jesus appears to the disciples, and it's the same account, but it just expands. So while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." Note all the things that are happening. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." They were surprised and thought he was a ghost, an aspect of, or so you can see that impact in terms of recognition. This is the parallel account that we'd just seen a little while ago in John, but they were shocked that it was him. They were afraid, they were troubled, doubt. They even thought he was a ghost. All of those things can mess about with perception. Jesus had to convince them that he was him. Cognitively, they didn't get it, but in terms of recognition, acknowledgement of the senses, or recall of the mind was playing tricks. It didn't seem just couldn't get their minds round it. But Jesus utilized or employed their senses so they could see the wounds, they could touch them, etc. So back to John chapter 21, and I hope you're still with me and haven't fallen asleep. 21 and verse 5. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. Didn't recognize his voice. And he spoke quite loudly, quite clearly, in a sense, to be heard. Not one. But they responded to the command of a stranger. Verse 6. They threw the net. It was a command from a stranger that they responded to. The voice was unique, and powerful, despite them being out all night and a bit tired, as it were. So they'd been out fishing all night. Dawn was just breaking, perhaps a reason for them not recognizing who Jesus was. They'd been out for hours fishing. Despite perhaps being within a distance to here, perhaps the lapping of the shore might even have got in the way. But in the dim light, they would not have been able to recognize his face, but not even to recognize his voice. But interestingly, from verses 4 to 6, verse 6, they throw out your net on the right side of the boat and you will find them. So they're close to the shore. We should say, throw the net out to the other side. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large amount of fish. They weren't novice fishermen. They knew what they were doing. They'd know where to fish. They'd know the currents. They'd know the best time of day. I'll come back to that. This is exactly what happened, though, a little while ago in Luke chapter 5 from verses 1 to 11, where Jesus had first called them to be his apostles. The point could not possibly have been a coincidence. In a sense, Jesus is recommissioning them. He's calling them again to the work of preaching. And perhaps as this was happening, they were having a feeling of deja vu, and perhaps they're beginning to get that cognitive recognition as to who this was. Had they possibly forsaken him they had forsaken him at his arrest? I'd imagine they'd been grievously shaken in faith by the following events. I think that's an understatement. Possibly undergoing a kind of PTSD, a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome. And we have lots of words for that. There's a lot of stuff on mental health and the rest of it. But I think they really would have been. They surely recognized beyond all doubt that they had thoroughly misunderstood his purpose. They needed to be challenged, woken up, rededicated again to the work he had for them. And it was about to happen here. Verse 7. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumped into the water. They knew him that instant, net bulging with fish. And perhaps they went right back to where they started remembering, golly, that was a net full of fish again. Another miraculous situation, preceded by a night of, golly, we haven't caught a thing. Nothing's happened, not a bite, nothing. Peter stripped for work, not necessarily naked, but stripped for work. Verse 7, his desire was to be with Jesus, in marked contrast with his reaction in Luke chapter 5 and verse 8, "Go away, I'm a sinful man." And at that point, there was an earlier great catch of fish. He'd grown in appreciation of who Jesus was. "Depart from me, a sinner." Now he rushed out to Jesus. He'd grown. There are a number of similarities and contrasts here with the narrative in Luke chapter 5. On that occasion, when Jesus told them to cast the net into the sea, Peter questioned Jesus' wisdom. But now there is no questioning, rather an immediate realization that it was Jesus who gave the instruction. He threw himself into the sea. Faith tested, and there was no hesitation. The nets were tearing, splitting, not this time. Verse 8. The other disciples followed the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. It required 2 boats to bring the fish to shore, and Peter was able to bring the fish in, as it were, on his own, to drag the net out of the water. Jesus said to him, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." Verse 11, Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of fish, 153. But with so many, the net was not torn. It should have been. 153 fish. Hold that number. I'm certain somebody's going to say something very intelligent about it. The little detail of that the disciples came in a little ship tells us that they had been using a larger ship to fish, and that the disciples on shore also had a ship so that they would work, as it were, with 2 boats. I think I always thought it was 1, but to bring in this net. So the other disciples came with the boat. It appears that the weight of the net loaded with fish was so great that they couldn't lift it into the boat, or perhaps they were afraid that the net would tear if they lifted it out of the water. They came towing the net loaded with the fish, and Jesus had cooked fish already. The disciples weren't expecting to see Jesus. They were going about their normal daily activities. On recognizing Jesus, Peter, and we presume the rest in the boat, dropped everything to go and meet Jesus. Does that reflect our feelings now? If Jesus was to return today, would we readily drop everything to be with him? Everything. When Jesus returned, will we drop everything? 153 fish. If you've noticed, I've cheated. 153 large fish. Catch of the year, probably. Or other things that we feel that we need to do before meeting him. So Peter dragged the net ashore, not before all the boat occupants were unable to haul in the catch, but the net held. A tired Peter pulling this net to shore. He was pulling it all on his own. He pulled 153 large fish. Now, I have to be honest, I am partial to fish. And at Christmas time, it's a little embarrassing. Morrison's will do a lovely deal for me on salmon. And it'll be a great price. And I'll probably buy, probably 2 kilos. A nice 2 kilos. That's sort of a £4 salmon. And that will do us a couple of days. It'll be lovely. And I'd view that as a large fish. But if you catch a large eel, that can be, oh golly, be kilos. Since you can fill me in on knowing that, probably fishing in Cornwall, but it's something massive. So 153 large fish is something colossal. A massive haul of fish. John's precise detail, stating exactly 153 fish, has to be significant. The only other place the number occurs is in 2 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 17. And here, the thousands of those strangers that were in the land of Israel, who David gathered to help prepare for the building of the temple. Wiser minds can come back to it for me. Here, the fishers could potentially represent the Gentiles, the disciples, as fishers of men, were looking to gather, but seeking not to lose any. Attention is being drawn by Jesus to the precise number of fish. 153, they say, is the symbolic number of the church, which is said to be the symbolic number of the church. That the net was full and yet didn't break. Jesus is saying that all that the Father has given me are mine. None can pluck them out of my hand. John chapter 10 and verse 28. I find it interesting that what they could, yeah, that what they could not all do in their own efforts out in the boat when they tried to pull the net into the boat in verse 8. So when they were all trying to do all of that, they couldn't do it. But Peter was able to do it by himself. Jesus told him to do it. Jesus said, "Now go and draw the net," in verse 11. And Peter, because God commanded it, was able to do it by himself, though all of the others were not able to do it earlier. The strength of the commands of Jesus, the very fact that he has told me to do it, if I will just endeavor, I can do it. We can do it. He gives us the ability to obey any command that he gives us, and so serve the Lord. Exaltation to us. You see, we can sometimes go out and try and do things on our own, and we are totally unsuccessful. I'm going fishing. We'll go with you. Human energy, human effort. They knew how. They knew where to throw the nets. Golly, as I said, they knew the tides. They knew the currents. They knew where the fish would be. They'd know where fishing runs, etc. 7 competent seamen didn't catch a thing. And then Jesus told them, and they caught a shoal. The difference being now their service was directed by the Lord. So the difference when you're doing something that the Lord is directing you to do, in contrast to doing something on our own impulse, as it were. Service directed by the Lord is more totally rewarding. Okay. Google is the worst thing in the world, but I had a little attempt. There is a word, Gematria, gematria, and it's an alphanumeric code where letters in the Greek and Hebrew alphabets have been given numerical value. So in English, the alphabet, this would be the equivalent to A equals 1, B equals 2, and so forth. That's the limit of my knowledge in this area. The number 153 is the numerical total for the Hebrew phrase Ani Elohim, which means I am God. The whole subject of gematria, however, is open to debate regarding its legitimacy. Jerome, a Christian priest, theologian, and historian, 347 to 420 AD, recorded that Greek zoologists believed there to be 153 different species of fish known at the time. I like that one. But the significance of 153 can be looked at in all sorts of different ways, and perhaps can be looked at in discussion. A week had passed since his resurrection, chapter 20 and verse 26. They needed to eat, hence the disciples were out fishing. They had homes to go to. John was supporting Mary. Had they stepped back to their former occupations? They needed a recall to get back to preaching. Do we? Here it is. Verse 12. Jesus said to him, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Who was the first person to recognize Jesus? Peter? No. On realizing, Peter threw on his shirt and dived into the sea. The catalyst in verse 7. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say this, we know. Being impetuous when Peter realized it was Jesus on the shore, he didn't want to wait for the others. He put on his outer coat and swam or waded to him. The others came in the boat in verse 8. Beside the Sea of Galilee, after Jesus' resurrection, the disciples had been convinced by what they had seen after his resurrection, that he was indeed the Christ. So the record here tells us that they did not ask, "Who art thou?" not because they were not sure or were surprised to see him. In fact, they'd seen him a number of times after his resurrection. They knew. None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew that it was the Lord. It would appear that the disciples were not actually able to get a good look at Jesus until they got to the shore. We might suppose that this would have been enough to clear up any doubts, although it should be remembered that there was something about the appearance of the risen Jesus which was different enough to make immediate recognition difficult. And immediate recognition seems to be a consistent theme. Immediate recognition always appeared to be difficult. Mary Magdalene didn't recognize him immediately. When he appeared to the disciples, he had to show them his hands and side before they are said to have recognized him. Jesus' appearance to the selected disciples after the resurrection were tiny snippets of time. It was not a case that he walked around freely as he had them before. And we're just told a small amount of what happened. It seems that he was not about at all except on these special occasions. This was the third time he'd shown himself alive, flesh and blood, as it were, to the disciples in verse 4. And we see that John said in verse 14, this was the third time Jesus has manifested himself to the disciples after his resurrection. First time was described in chapter 20, verses 19 to 23. The second time, 26 to 29. We should probably understand that this is a reference to the appearances to the disciples as a group, since at least one additional appearance is mentioned in the fourth gospel itself, chapter 20, verses 14 to 17, to Mary Magdalene and to Luke and Paul. And Luke and Paul both mention a prior appearance to Peter, which may or may not constitute another appearance. But now is the third time. That is, this was the third time he appeared unto the apostles when all or most of them were together. So he appeared to 10 of them, verse 19, to 11 of them, verse 26, and this time to 7 of them, 21 and verse 2. You can collate them all together. This may have been the 7th time, but there are a number of occasions. I'm almost coming to the end. So, all told, this may have been the 11th time in which he distinctly manifested himself after his resurrection. But there might have been many other manifestations, some potentially almost too small to mention, which the other writers may have thought not proper to mention or to count. Verse 14, John records that this was Jesus' third appearance to his disciples. Clearly, this means that the third time he appeared to a group consisting primarily of the 11 apostles, those who would be his special witnesses. So specifically, it was the third time Jesus has appeared to the group, and John was part of it. He obviously is not accounting the appearances to Mary and the other women, etc. The previous 2 times were recorded, as I've said. He appears to them 3 times. We have the record, so he has appeared to us too, quite frequently, more than once, twice, 3, 4 times. More times than even they, the 12, have experienced in one sense. Imagine that. How lucky are we? That is an exhortation to us. And I'm going to shock you because I'm going to stop.